I know if you go out into the deep, dark woods and see any kind of cryptid, that is a life-changing experience. But what happens when the cryptid comes to you? Now, the writer of today's story only used his initials NC, so we are going to call him Nick, and we're going to call his friends Chad, Brian, and Rick. Now, the summer after graduating from high school in the metro area of Detroit in Michigan, every weekend was grad party after grad party after grad party. So it wasn't until almost the end of summer before Nick's best friend Chad had his grad party. Now, Chad's house backs up to a wooded area, and the lot of the house itself is probably about 50 to 100 yards long and maybe 20 to 30 yards wide. So kind of like a narrow football field. But it's small enough that you can actually see the house on the other side of it during the day, kinda, and you can see the lights on in the house at night. And most of the other houses in the area are older people, so most people go to bed by 10 o'clock in that neighborhood. And I also want to take a moment to point out that neither Nick nor any of his friends ever drank alcohol or used any other kind of intoxicating substances. So Chad's party is a great success and it goes on all day, but once it starts to get dark, the party starts to die down until there's only 5 of them left. Nick, Chad, Brian, and a couple more of their friends. And around 10 p.m., they decide, you know what? It's a really good night for a bonfire. So they get some wood together and they get some lighter fluid and a lighter and they get a nice little fire going for themselves. And they spend about an hour sharing stories and laughing and having a great time until one of their friends has to leave, leaving only 4 of them. Then about a half an hour later, another friend has to leave. And her boyfriend, Brian, says to the guys, you know what? I'm going to go take her home, but I will be right back. And just like that, now it's just Nick and Chad. Now, Nick and Chad are sitting opposite each other around the fire. Chad is actually facing the woods, and Nick has his back to the woods. And they start hearing some noises. Nothing major, just leaves rustling and some twigs breaking. And Chad laughs it off and says, don't worry, it's just the neighbor's cat. And as they continue to sit around and chew the fat, the noises continue. But Nick keeps brushing them off because it's the cat. However, he becomes a little unnerved when they both hear something that sounds like footsteps in the front yard. And at first, they think that it's Brian coming back. But after a few minutes of Brian not appearing, they know it's not him. But eventually, Brian does come back. And he comes and sits next to Chad, facing the woods. And they all start talking again like nothing ever happened. A couple of minutes later, the noises from the woods start up again. But this time, they're closer. Much closer. And Nick can see that Chad is really unnerved at this point. And Nick says, hey, it's just the cat, remember? And Chad looks at Nick and says, there is no cat. I just made that up to make myself feel better. At that point, Nick stands up, grabs his chair, brings it around to the other side of the fire, and sits between his 2 friends facing the woods. And after Nick spouts a few choice words to Chad about letting him sit there with his back to the woods, things take a bit of a turn. They see something move in the brush. It's slight, but it's noticeable. It looks fairly big, too. Maybe 5 feet tall and kind of human-like. And the boys try to joke it off and convince themselves it's nothing, which actually does work for a while, until a few minutes later when they start to see more movement. And these bits of movement continue for a few more minutes until they're getting noticeably closer. And at that point, the 3 boys say, done, and decide to go inside the house. And they quickly start to pick up all of the things around them that they need to take in the house and put the lid on the fire pit, which is really just an old dome barbecue without the legs, so it has a lid with a handle. And while the boys are hustling around, this thing, whatever it is, continues to get closer. It kind of seems hesitant, but curious at the same time. And it kind of darts around the edges of the wood line. Finally, the boys have everything they need. They rush inside the house, lock the door, and immediately run to the windows to see if they can see this thing. But whatever this thing is, it saw them go inside. So it starts to get even closer. And it darts by all of the windows. And the boys on the inside are running from window to to try to get a glimpse of this thing. And they make out some basic details. It's like 4 to 5 feet tall when it's kind of hunched over, and it's humanoid and kind of pale. Almost white, but more kind of like a gray pale. And this little cat and mouse game lasts like a good 10 minutes until they start hearing its nails scratching on the deck outside the house. And then around this time, it kind of shifts its focus from the boys to the fire, where apparently the boys didn't put the lid on all the way. And Chad calls Nick and Brian over to the window that faces the fire. The lid that was on the fire pit is off, and they can see this thing darting around the fire. Later, they would find that lid about 10 feet away from their fire pit. So something had to pick it up by the hot metal handle and throw it over there. And about this time is when they notice that it's around some other windows too. That's when they figure out there isn't just one of these things. There are multiple things. Nick says if he had to guess, there's 4 or 5 of them. And this general activity goes on for about 20 minutes. When Nick decides it's time to go home, and Brian says, I'll go too. That way we can go to our cars together. And both Nick and Brian park like maybe 20 or 30 yards from the house. But since all of this activity has done nothing but increase over the last 20 minutes, that 20 yards seems more like a mile. And after Chad tries and fails to convince them to stay, the 2 boys are out the door and at their cars in less than 10 seconds. But as both of them are running to their cars, they actually take glances over into the backyard, and they can see multiple creatures crouching about halfway down all around the house. And some are in open parts of the yard looking at them, and others are behind the trees looking at the back of the house. And as Brian and Nick drive away, Nick looks back and sees the shape of a round head looking in one of the windows of the house. And as they leave Chad's neighborhood, which is kind of a hidden wooded area, they both see something cross the road behind their cars. And when Nick and Brian get home, they jump into a group chat with Chad. And Nick asks Brian what he saw after they left. And what Brian described is exactly the same thing that Nick saw, with no prompting from Nick. So any doubts that Nick may have had about his own sanity are out the window with the confirmations from Chad and Brian about what they saw that night. And as the 3 of them are recounting the things that they all saw that night, Chad is continuing to update them on things that are continuing to happen at his house. Besides seeing figures outside the windowsill, Chad says he saw a face looking in the window, pale skin and black eyes. He describes them as almost being like holes in the face. They were so dark. And he also said at some point something scratched the screen on his window. Needless to say, they're all terrified, to say the least. Now, sensible people wouldn't try to recreate the events of that night, right? Well, Nick guesses that they're not all that sensible because the next night they were right back at it. They knew what they saw and they needed validation. And because it's too dark for pictures or for taking video, they actually have another friend, Rick, come over so he can back up their claims. So they set up the night just like the night before. They get a fire going, they sit down in their chairs and wait for things to begin. And once it gets dark out, they hear the rustling in the brush again. And an hour or so later, the noises start getting closer. And once again, Nick moves himself over to the other side of the fire pit, so all 4 boys are facing the woods. And within minutes, they see whatever is out there is moving through the brush again. There are probably about 2 or 3 of these things at this point. And all the boys try to hold out for a while, kind of testing themselves to see how manly they are. But this attitude changes a few minutes later when the pale creatures start coming out and fanning out to their sides. The creatures are surrounding them. The boys get up and calmly put the lid on their fire. They're thinking that if they show fear, these things might just attack. And as soon as the lid is on the fire and they gather up everything else that they need, they rush inside the house. And it only takes a few minutes before the creatures are darting past the windows again. And Rick, who wasn't there the night before, agrees there is something out there. And as a little time passes, they gather up their courage and they go outside and stand on the deck that is attached to the house. And they stand there as the crawlers get closer. And there's more of them this time. There's probably about 5 or 6 at this point. And the boys just stand there and watch. And they can tell these things seem kind of curious with just a hint of mischief. Some of them are standing there watching the boys, but some other ones are running all around. One even scratches the underside of the deck right under Nick's feet. He can feel its nail drag across the wood. After all this, the boys have had enough and they hurry back into the house. And Nick and Brian and Rick decide it's time to leave. And again, they see these creeper things in the yard as they bolt to their cars. Now, all these things happened a little while ago. But Nick says the other night he was out driving around and decided to drive through that neighborhood again just to kind of reminisce about old times. And as he's driving through, he sees 4 or 5 of these pale creatures hunched over and moving all about. They're still there. And Nick says the thought of it still terrifies him to this day. And if you need your creepiness cup to runneth over, go ahead and click on this video. And we will see you again on the In-Between.